In the early hours of November 1944, a folder was left on Molotov's desk. It contained a 66-page typewritten report with the non-committal working title Straits. The document was developed by the Commission for the Preparation of Peace Treaties and Post-War Arrangements, known simply as the Litvinov Commission. Yes, the same Litvinov who oversaw the USSR's international policy in the 1930s as foreign minister. History buffs probably know that, in early May 1939, Stalin, recognizing the need to get closer to Hitler, replaced Litvinov with Molotov and initiated a new course in foreign policy. Litvinov himself was no longer needed. From that moment on, his career went downhill. During World War II, he held several sinecure positions. This allowed the Kremlin ruler to control him while keeping him available when needed. Litvinov's official position during this period was Deputy People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the USSR. He briefly served as ambassador to the United States and Cuba, and from the fall of 1943, he chaired the commission in question. Although kept in the dark professionally, his expertise remained intact. That's why the report he helped produce remains extremely valuable. Through it, we learn firsthand how Moscow viewed the Turkish Straits at the end of the war, historically and politically, and what possible solutions they proposed. Throughout its 1,000-year history, Constantinople, also known as Istanbul, was besieged at least 35 times. Most of these sieges were unsuccessful. The name Russia, or more precisely Rus, appears only once on this list in 941, when Kievan Prince Igor blockaded the Byzantine capital by land and sea. However, he failed to penetrate it with his troops, and withdrew after suffering a defeat. From that moment onward, every autocrat of the Russian lands who dreamed of controlling the straits connecting the Black and Mediterranean seas understood one thing clearly. The straits could only be reached by land, and that meant passing through territories inhabited by Bulgarians. The first to attempt this was Kievan Prince Svetoslav. Between 966 and 971, he devastated the Bulgarian kingdom with his pagan army. His ambition to reach the walls of the largest city in the world at that time was halted in 970 by the Byzantines in eastern Thrace, near what is now the Turkish city of Lüleburgaz, then called Arkadiopol. The following year, he was defeated near Drastar, now known as Silistra. The barbarian prince lost his life soon after, on his way home. Another 700 years would pass before Russia resumed its southern campaigns. Moscow's Black Sea ambitions began during the reign of Peter I. Though he later earned the title the Great, he was not connected to the first two military campaigns to Crimea in 1687 and 1689. He was still a minor at the time. Peter I took control of the state at 17 in 1689. From the start, the young Tsar understood that Russia could become a great power only if it had access to an ice-free sea. His campaign against Sweden, which lasted almost a quarter of a century, ended successfully. The newly proclaimed Russian Empire gained a long stretch of coastline along the eastern Baltic Sea. But Peter I's efforts in the Black Sea region ended in disaster. In the summer of 1711, his army was surrounded south of today's Romanian city of Iasi. The ambitious ruler barely avoided capture and was forced to ask for peace and humiliation. The 1713 Treaty of Adrianople stripped Peter I of his only port in the region, the fortress of Azov on the sea of the same name, and ended his naval ambitions there. Catherine II achieved the most in terms of expanding the empire in the southwest. The empress, with German blood in her veins, and widely known as Catherine the Great, fought two fairly successful wars with the Ottomans. As a result, she added the territory of present-day southern Ukraine to her possessions, along with Crimea. There was also a bonus. After the First War, which ended in 1774, Russia officially gained the right to protect the Balkan Orthodox Christians. This unleashed another megalomaniacal impulse in the ambitious German ruler, sparking the birth of the so-called Greek project. It envisioned nothing less than the restoration of former Byzantium, within the borders of present-day Greece and Bulgaria, plus the Straits, Constantinople, and much of the Black Sea, Aegean, and Mediterranean coasts of Asia Minor. North of the Danube, a state called Dacia was to emerge, encompassing present-day Moldova and eastern and southern Romania. This new state would serve as a buffer between Russia and the then-powerful Austria. As you might guess, the Byzantine project favored mostly the Greek Orthodox population and left out the Bulgarians and similar smaller peoples entirely. Neither during Catherine the Great's lifetime nor after her death were any steps taken to implement it, mostly because other influential European powers categorically opposed the idea. Each subsequent war with the Ottoman Empire brought Russia closer to the Straits. The climax came in 1833, when, at the Sultan's request, Russian ships arrived at the Bosphorus and landed a force to protect Constantinople from possible capture by rebellious Egyptian governor Muhammad Ali Pasha. The Treaty of Ankara-Skelessi was signed, forming a military alliance between the two empires. It obliged Russia to assist the Sultan in future conflicts if necessary. In return, the Russian Empire received significant advantages for shipping in the Black Sea. A secret clause in the treaty allowed its warships to pass freely through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. Russia could also demand the closure of those straits to vessels from third countries. This clause was clearly aimed at Britain and France, giving Russia exceptional leverage in the Mediterranean region. London was seriously alarmed. Over the following decades, Britain made strong efforts to bolster the Ottoman Empire's military so that third-party guarantees would not be needed. Britain also worked on shaping international law. Immediately after the Treaty of Ankara-Skelessi, a Straits Convention was signed in London in 1841. It eliminated Russia's previously gained advantages. Its warships were once again barred from passing through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. Only the Ottomans and their close allies retained that privilege. Since then, neither the Russian Empire nor its successors, the USSR and today's Russian Federation, ever came as close again to mastering the Turkish Straits as in the 1830s, when Catherine the Great's grandson, Nicholas I, was effectively the master of them. For over a century, bloody wars were waged, diplomacy was deployed to pressure Turkey and its allies, and countless secret negotiations and treaties were pursued. Yet all were in vain. The Russian boot never set foot on the Bosphorus again. Nicholas I's attempt to regain influence in the Straits region ended disastrously. Russia suffered a humiliating defeat in the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, losing not just regional power but also the right to maintain a military fleet in the Black Sea. Nicholas I himself did not live to see this collapse. The peace treaty in Paris was signed on behalf of his firstborn son, the new Emperor Alexander II, who would later be known as the Liberator. The most important effect of the Treaty of Paris was the transformation of the Black Sea and its coastline into a demilitarized zone. Both Russia and the Ottoman Empire were prohibited from stationing naval forces in Black Sea ports. No country could build military facilities, such as fortresses, fortifications, or arsenals, along the coast. A new convention on the Straits was also attached to the treaty. It banned the entry of military ships into the Black Sea and declared Danube River navigation to be free. Beyond the military defeats, Russia's regional policy suffered a heavy blow. It was forced to relinquish its holdings in the Danube Delta region and its protectorates over Wallachia, Moldova, and Serbia. Wallachia and Moldova, which were united 5 years later into the state of Romania, had always been seen by Russian autocrats as the first step to controlling the Straits by land. That's why, to the very end, Tsarist Russia fought hard to keep Bessarabia, today's Moldova. The Bolsheviks did the same, and Stalin brutally annexed the territory in 1940. And it was the Straits that fueled Stalin's fury with Hitler. In autumn 1940, a government came to power in Bucharest that fully aligned with Romania's policy with Germany. Stalin knew that without control over Romania, he couldn't control Bulgaria, and without Bulgaria, he'd never reach the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. That's why, even while allied with the US and Britain during World War II, the powerful Soviet leader insisted Romania fall within the USSR's sphere of interest. In the end, despite Allied resistance, they were forced to concede. The period in which the Black Sea was a demilitarized zone for the first time in human history didn't last long. The new Russian Emperor, Alexander II, clearly understood that the main reason for his country's defeat in the Crimean War was its extreme backwardness in every respect compared to leading industrial nations. As a result, he carried out a series of liberal reforms that touched nearly every aspect of Russian society and economy. The most important of these was the abolition of serfdom, which finally freed the peasants and gave them land. This act, not the later liberation of Bulgaria, as many mistakenly believe, is what earned him the nickname Liberator. A significant reform was also carried out in the army. Universal military conscription was introduced, and massive rearmament with modern weapons was initiated. In foreign policy, Alexander II aimed to restore the empire's prestige after the disastrous Crimean War. He focused on active intervention on the so-called Eastern Question, namely the internal affairs of the Ottoman Empire and its relations with its numerous Christian subjects. The culmination of the emperor's foreign policy efforts was undoubtedly the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78. It resulted in the appearance of a new state on Europe's political map, Bulgaria, as well as full independence for Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania. Russia, in turn, regained southern Bessarabia, including access to the Danube Delta, and made significant territorial gains in the Caucasus, such as today's Georgian Black Sea port of Batumi and much of western Armenia. Yet, the results of the war satisfied practically no one. Not only did many existing problems remain unsolved, but a number of new ones were created, some of which persist to this day. Russia began remilitarizing the Black Sea shortly after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, when a new powerful player, United Germany, appeared on Europe's map. From St. Petersburg, they tried to corner Germany, while France, one of the parties to the 1856 agreement, was significantly weakened. As early as November 1870, Alexander II, through his foreign minister Prince Gorchakov, publicly declared that Russia would no longer comply with the restrictions of the 1856 Treaty of Paris on warships. He also released the Sultan from the same limitations. Russia's main objection was that Ottoman Turkey faced no restrictions on maintaining a battle fleet on the Sea of Marmara. Additionally, France and Britain could freely concentrate their squadrons in the Mediterranean. The dispatch did not hide Alexander II's dissatisfaction with Wallachia and Moldova uniting into one state, and especially with a foreign prince appointed as its ruler. Once again, this reaffirmed the idea that control over Romania was essential for Russian domination of the Balkans and the Straits. By the time war broke out with Ottoman Turkey, later called the Liberation War, Russia had a modest fleet of 2 battleships and auxiliary vessels, as well as coastal fortifications and port installations. Yet, its available naval power was still smaller than that of the Ottomans, who had abandoned sail and adopted steam-powered ironclads. Russia's main effort to change the Straits situation came via diplomacy. A new conference was held in London in March 1871, but its outcomes only cancelled certain clauses of the Treaty of Paris related to Danube navigation. The final document reaffirmed the Sultan's authority to allow or deny foreign warships through the Straits and confirmed the Black Sea's openness to commercial shipping. Notably, 6 countries signed the London Convention this time, including newly unified Germany and Italy, reflecting a shift in Europe's power dynamics. Alexander II was dissatisfied with the outcome and continued seeking opportunities to alter the Black Sea status quo in Russia's favor. One such opportunity arose in 1876, when Christian uprisings in Bosnia and central Bulgaria were brutally crushed, hinting at another war with the Ottoman Empire. That summer, diplomats from St. Petersburg held talks with Austria over a possible political reconfiguration of the Balkans in case of Russian victory. This was the Reichstag Agreement. One of its points proposed turning Constantinople into a free city. The agreement also affirmed Russia's claim to southern Bessarabia, long seen as the essential first step for controlling the Danube Delta and potentially the Bosphorus. The Reichstag decisions were confirmed in the secret Budapest Convention between Russia and Austria-Hungary in January 1877. Interestingly, an added clause limited Russia's annexation rights in Europe to its old borders in southern Bessarabia before 1856. In other words, even if Alexander II managed to enter Constantinople, he'd have no legal way to keep it. By early 1878, it was evident that the Ottoman Empire was on the brink of collapse, and its final defeat in the war was only a matter of time. A new phase of Russo-British rivalry came to the forefront, nearly escalating into a full-scale conflict. Concerned that Alexander II might try to seize the Ottoman capital, thus threatening British interests in the Mediterranean and Middle East, Queen Victoria sent a powerful squadron to the Sea of Marmara to protect the Christian population of Constantinople. The first few months of the year were filled with diplomatic maneuvering, negotiations, veiled threats, ambassadorial meetings, and an exchange of letters and telegrams between London and St. Petersburg. The situation eventually calmed, and a repeat of the Crimean War was avoided. The dispute was resolved by a document officially titled Agreement on the Amendment of the Treaty of San Stefano, signed on May 30, 1878 in London. In many respects, it confirmed the decisions regarding Balkan organization that had been formulated in the Reichstag and Budapest conventions. It also reaffirmed the current status of the Straits. According to the agreement, the existing arrangements for navigation through the Straits were deemed wise and beneficial, and the British government saw no reason to alter them. The Russian representative likewise agreed to maintain the status quo at the upcoming Berlin Congress. The Berlin Congress began 2 weeks later and satisfied everyone, except Bulgaria. The country was cut down so severely from the Treaty of San Stefano that it was barely visible on international maps. For Bulgarians, this outcome was both a shock and a trauma. The so-called San Stefano Bulgaria became a long-cherished yet elusive ideal that they pursued with extraordinary effort in the decades to follow. On several occasions, they nearly realized it, only to taste bitter defeat each time. Preserving the status quo in the Straits left a better taste for all Russians with influence on the issue, from Alexander II to the newspaper-reading intelligentsia. As early as 1879, the emperor returned to the idea of a military solution, but only in the event of the Ottoman Empire's collapse. Plans to seize the Bosphorus by amphibious assault were revived during the reign of his grandson Nicholas II, the last Russian emperor. Immediately upon ascending the throne, he and his general staff began strategizing how best to block the entry of a large European, primarily British, squadron into the Black Sea, while also strengthening Russia's political influence in the Balkans. Despite extensive documentation and hours spent in meetings, no real action materialized. One key reason was that early 20th century Russian naval strategy prioritized the Baltic Sea. Still, that didn't stop the empire from fiercely protecting its interests in the Black Sea Straits. For example, during the Balkan War of 1912, when Bulgarian troops advanced dangerously close to Constantinople, and Tsar Ferdinand openly expressed his desire to enter the Ottoman capital on a white horse, St. Petersburg explicitly warned him not to cross the Media-Inos line. If needed, they would dispatch their own fleet to the Straits. Ultimately, the Media-Inos line marked the limit of Bulgaria's territorial expansion into southeast Thrace in 1913 and briefly served as a national border. The line resurfaced during World War I, when the Entente considered how to partition the collapsing Ottoman Empire, and again in late 1940, when Stalin tried to lure Bulgaria with territorial gains, so he could capture the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles himself. At the start of World War I, Russia found itself in a disadvantageous position, forced to fight simultaneously against two mighty empires, Germany and Austria-Hungary, without being fully prepared. A clash with the Ottoman Empire was looming on the horizon. This latest, and as it turned out final, Russo-Turkish War would be waged both on land in the Caucasus and at sea in the Black Sea. In neither of these theaters of war could Russia expect a clear advantage over its age-old adversary. Thus, diplomacy came into play. Once again, Bulgaria, due to its key geographical position, became the centerpiece of Russian Balkan policy. Unlike 2 years prior, this time diplomacy would use the carrot rather than the stick. It was crucial for Russia that Sofia remained at least neutral. Bulgaria's army was undoubtedly the strongest on the peninsula. Which side Tsar Ferdinand chose would significantly influence Romania, Greece, and Turkey. The hope was that if Bulgaria sided with Russia, it would pin down substantial Turkish forces in Thrace and also intimidate Romania into not allying with Germany. To achieve this goal, Russia tried to persuade Serbia to cede its territories with concentrated Bulgarian populations, which it had seized after the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913. Although Serbia was locked in a life-or-death struggle against the far stronger Austria-Hungary, it categorically refused to yield to Russian diplomatic pressure. Despite the otherwise good relations between Belgrade and Petrograd, as the Russian capital of St. Petersburg would now be named. Foreign Minister Sazonov, obsessed with the idea that the Russian flag must fly over the Straits at any cost, began contemplating a purely military solution. From the 2nd of November 1914, Russia and the Ottoman Empire were officially at war, yet the primary battlefield between them was the Caucasus, as Russia simply didn't have enough available forces. Sazonov's official inquiry to the Russian General Staff received a disheartening response. To fully capture the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, around 30 divisions or 500,000 soldiers would be needed. Such a massive allocation of forces would only be possible after decisive victory on the main front against Germany and Austria-Hungary. As the situation for Russia worsened on all fronts, the fate of the Straits after the war became the focal point of Russian diplomacy in early 1915. The only apparent way to turn the tide on the battlefield was the direct intervention of Russia's Western allies. Hoping for a miracle, on the last day of 1914, the Supreme Commander, Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, a cousin of Emperor Nicholas II, wrote letters to the governments in London and Paris, and as unlikely as it seemed, the miracle happened. The British and French had also been deliberating on where to redirect part of their efforts and concluded that the best course was to attack the weakest link in the enemy coalition, Ottoman Turkey. Specifically, a swift and bold assault through the Dardanelles toward Constantinople would establish direct maritime contact with Russia and, most importantly, cut off Ottoman communication with its far more industrially and militarily powerful allies. Winston Churchill, then head of the British Navy and yet to be Prime Minister, took charge of this daring plan. From that point onwards, events unfolded rapidly. On 19th of February 1915, a joint Anglo-French squadron launched a massive bombardment on Ottoman fortifications along the Dardanelles coastline. Russia, worried that Constantinople might fall before it could get everything it wanted, convened an emergency government meeting to outline its territorial demands. After heated debate, Russia would insist its Western allies support its claim to the entire European part of thrice south of the Media-Inos line. The coastal regions of Asia Minor, facing the Sea of Marmara, the Aegean islands of Imbros, Tenedos, Lemnos, and Samothrace, guarding the western approach to the Straits, and naturally, Constantinople itself. Just when these plans seemed settled, Foreign Minister Sazonov learned that, in addition to a naval operation, the Entente allies planned an amphibious assault to land tens of thousands of British and French troops on the European shore of the Dardanelles. This news drove the already anxious Sazonov to near hysteria, prompting him to demand a swift Russian operation around the Bosphorus. The response? It would take more than a month to organize such a landing. To further fuel tension in Petrograd, French and British newspapers began widely promoting the idea that after the war, all nations should have equal access to the Straits. Time was clearly not on Russia's side, so Sazonov played his trump card. He summoned the French and British ambassadors and told them plainly, the moment had arrived to sign an official agreement among the three allies regarding the post-war fate of the Straits. With firm resolve, he asked whether the Russian people could count on its allies in achieving their national goal. He added emphatically, Britain and France must loudly proclaim their agreement that on the day peace is declared, Constantinople will be given to Russia. From today's perspective, it's hard to say how genuine or staged Sazonov's emotional appeals were. To magnify the effect, Emperor Nicholas II soon joined the effort. On the 3rd of March, he told French Ambassador Paleolog, "The issue of the Straits deeply stirs Russian public opinion. With each passing day, it grows more urgent. I cannot demand my people make sacrifices for this war without being able to offer them a reward, the fulfillment of their age-old dream. Therefore, Mr. Ambassador, my decision is made. I shall decisively resolve the problem of Constantinople and the Straits." When Paleolog cautiously asked what France would gain in return, the emperor suggested they carve off a large portion of German territory, reaching as far as Mainz and Koblenz, and even beyond. Nicholas II wasn't the only one demonstrating that Russians excel at achieving their goals by spinning intrigue to others' detriment. Sazonov threatened to resign if his demands weren't met. Newspapers stirred public emotions, and rumors spread that Petrograd was preparing a separate peace with Germany to free up troops for the Bosphorus. These whispers inevitably found their way to the sensation-hungry Western press, prompting fear among French and British leaders that Russia might suddenly change course. The bluffing and pressure tactics orchestrated by both Nicholas II and Sazonov worked. By early April 1915, following a series of intense negotiations, the French and British ambassadors presented the Russian government with written assurances that Russia would gain full control of the Straits, pending one small condition from the wartime perspective: victory. This agreement initially had a positive effect on Entente unity. Mutual trust grew. Talks of a separate peace vanished. The moment was even leveraged to draw Italy into the war, with promises of territorial gains in the Balkans and Asia Minor. Yet, despite this hopeful beginning, everything in Southeast Europe soon turned upside down. The British-French landing at Gallipoli on 25th of April 1915 met unexpectedly fierce resistance from the Ottoman army. Tens of thousands of troops, including from Australia, New Zealand, and Africa, were pinned down on the beachhead. A month into the operation, its chief architect, Winston Churchill, was dismissed from his position as First Lord of the Admiralty, but the stalemate remained. Russia failed to assist. Its Black Sea Fleet conducted heavy bombardments on Ottoman fortifications along the Bosphorus, without significant effect. The major Russian landing, planned near Constantinople for May 1915, was cancelled, as the Caucasian Corps assigned to the mission was urgently redirected to Galicia to battle Austro-Hungarian forces. Desperate to revive the faltering Dardanelles campaign, Entente diplomats began probing the Ottoman Empire's neighboring countries to entice them into the war. But Greeks, Romanians, and Bulgarians had too many old grievances, especially with one another, to easily relinquish their neutral status. Romania responded to intentive proposals with a counter-demand. Russia should return Bessarabia, which it had annexed in 1878. The French and British pleaded with Sazonov and the Emperor to accept this, arguing that Russia would gain much more after victory. But the Russians were used to acquiring, not relinquishing, territory, and the pleas were rejected. In Greece, King Constantine I, an admirer of Germany and avowed Bulgarian hater, was too impressed by German military successes to consider entering the war against them. The Entente's hope was Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos, an anti-monarchist. But in 1915 he was twice forced to resign by the king and was ultimately sidelined. For the Russians, this was welcome news. Venizelos was a passionate advocate for the Megali idea, Greece's grand vision to claim Constantinople as its own. Amid this backdrop, Bulgaria became the Entente's final hope of attacking the Ottomans from the rear, but Sofia had conditions. Serbia and Greece must return to Bulgarian-populated territories lost after the Second Balkan War. Russia, Britain, and France saw the conditions as fair, but Serbia and Greece refused any border adjustments. They firmly rebuffed diplomatic advances from the Entente, maintaining the status quo. Ultimately, Tsar Ferdinand chose the side that guaranteed Bulgaria the return of all its lost territories, Germany and Austria-Hungary. Thus, unwittingly, he dashed the centuries-old ambition of Russian emperors to fly their flag over Constantinople. In mid-October 1915, with Bulgaria joining the Central Powers, the Balkan theater entered a new phase. Bulgaria's army, the strongest in the region at the time, crushed the Serbian forces within weeks and drove the remnants into the Albanian mountains. Bulgaria's advantages lay not only in solid preparation and organization, but also in extremely high morale, and above all, an intense thirst for retribution. Serbia's total collapse caused dismay among the Entente ranks and completely shattered the plans of the British, French, and Russians. A gradual evacuation of the troops trapped under constant shelling at Gallipoli began. Relations between Russia and Bulgaria had been tense ever since 1878, due to persistent efforts by the Russian imperial court to turn the young Balkan country into a client state. The Bulgarians, however, steadily gravitated toward Western Europe, particularly Germany, and even temporarily severed diplomatic ties with Russia in response to such pressures. Open conflict erupted in autumn 1915, when the two Slavic-speaking countries found themselves on opposing sides of the war. The first act of aggression came from the Russians. On 14th of October 1915, their naval squadron indiscriminately shelled the port city of Varna, resulting in dozens of civilian casualties. A formal Russo-Bulgarian war took shape in autumn 1916, shortly after Romania joined the war on the Entente side. In early September, Bulgarian troops launched a decisive offensive in Dobruja, liberating this historic Bulgarian region and dealing a serious blow to both Romanian forces and the supporting Russian army corps. This extinguished Russian hopes of cutting through Bulgarian territory to reach the Straits and strike the Ottomans from behind. By February 1917, the Russian Empire was in full-blown crisis. Political, economic, military, and above all, moral. That month, the so-called February Revolution reached its climax. The monarchy was overthrown and a provisional government took power. It was swiftly recognized internationally by the major powers and, out of inertia, continued to honor Russia's obligations to the Entente. Likewise, the dream of seizing the Straits persisted out of habit, but by then it was nothing more than a dream.